It is the 21st century. There are too many video games. But out there, it's waiting. The best video game you've never played. Hello and welcome to The Best Video Game You've Never Played, the podcast where I, stand-up and improv comedian Lewis Dunn, take on the suggestions of my guests to try and find out the best video game that I have never played. I take their suggestion, I play it for a week, and then I come back and say to them, yes, you have found a hidden gem among a pile of otherwise faulty or non-realistic gems. Or I say to them, this is just a coloured piece of glass. This is just a coloured piece of glass you've handed me. This isn't worth anything, really. It's quite sharp and dangerous, actually. This week's guest is Mungo Tatton Brown, a man who has actually worked in the video game industry, so he actually understands what it is like to try and make video games, from just having a computer in front of you to actually producing a game that we can all play and enjoy. He has brought on a game that, frankly, is one of the most interesting but also politically charged video games I have ever played. So, up front, this is a big warning. This episode contains lots of heavy themes, including, but not limited to, racism, homophobia, ideas of identity, free will, the philosophy of existence. It's a very heavy episode, so what I'm basically trying to tell you right now up front is, if you aren't in the mood for a big, heavy one right now, maybe pause this one, come back to another time. But if you stick around, I think you're in for one of the most interesting discussions I've ever had on this podcast, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. You might even find yourself listening to this and thinking about things other than video games. I certainly hope so. I certainly feel like we end up discussing some issues that are pertinent to the world that we live in right now. So, with that in mind, grab yourself a nice, well-mixed drink and listen to the podcast as we find out what game has been brought on by Mungo Tatton Brown. Hello, Mungo. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm as well as I can be, considering that the world is dying in many different ways all at once.
The world is dying in many different ways, Mungo, but we have, in the dying light of civilization, the joy of video games and a lot of time to play them because going outside is illegal.
That's true. I've had a period. I've played so many games last year and this year where I had a moment just yesterday when I was looking at my desktop screen and I was wondering if I could possibly play any games because I was kind of a dreading thing. It's like this is my life now. I'd never thought that would happen.
Well, this is one of the wonderful things about this podcast for me. Is genuinely been. You're right. Basically, hundreds and hundreds of video games exist, and there's just no way to filter down to the ones that you think you should actually play.
Yeah, it can be decision fatigue, right? Like, that's often one of the difficult things. And I think with the stores, like the innovations that the game stores, like the Epic Game Store, tend to do, is like having a UI where you just can't see as many games at once. Because they've worked out that we're overwhelmed, right? Like the PlayStation Store, I don't know what the PlayStation 5 one is, but there's not that many games on screen at once. And I can remember when Steam came out, obviously there weren't as many games, so they could fill it all up and then that was fine. Whereas now they just they smooth them out, they make the images a bit bigger. They're like, well, this is me as a designer thinking about that now, actually.
Rhapsodizing about UI, which is good, which is a good reason to have you on this podcast, Mungo, because you are someone who has been involved in making video games.
Yes, so I've made my own games as a hobbyist. I did PR, and in fact, actually, so we're going to be talking today about the game Red Strings Club, which came out in, I think, 2018, 2017 or something. But that was actually, when I was at PR at Indigo Pearl, I got that game for free. So I think I should just kind of qualify this whole episode by saying, like, 3 or 4 years ago, I got this game for free. So I might be a little bit biased, but
Yes, no, we should well establish now. You are a paid shill for the Red Strings Club. You are
exactly.
You are purely here to boost its Metacritic score on this, a podcast that does not hand out scores.
And I do design tools for game writers. So I've chosen quite a narrative game, and one that's quite philosophical. It's quite noir. It's quite cyberpunk. And that I think fits very well with my role in the universe and also my role in our friendship as well.
Well, that's very nice. I think of our friendship as a noir cyberpunk friendship as well. I think that's very much the tone that we have between the two of us.
What I mean by it is, like, you're a philosopher, right? Like, maybe you're not a professional philosopher, but you are. That's what I think of you, Lewis. It's like you're a guy who likes to ask questions that we don't really have any means of answering. That's one of your...
Yeah. and my goal is to corrupt the youth and then drink hemlock. That is true.
Yes. I mean, we've got this game today, which is doing the worst sin of all games. It's a game that contains politics. And Lewis,
well,
you're not meant to have politics in games. Like, I play my games to get away from politics, to get away from thinking about the world, having emotions. Like, I just want to sit down, get that kind of static screen, like a whole lot of grey and white dots, and time passes, and then I wake up and I've played a game. That's what I want my experience to be. Anything else is just... far left propaganda.
Absolutely, yeah. What you want is a series of dopamine hits doled out by a randomised slot machine. That's ideally what a video game is.
The only good game is the one that the rats play when they have the wires put straight into their brains.
What's your favourite video game? I like rat games. That's my favourite. I like to play rat games. Well, look, we've talked around the topic for a while. For the sake of our listeners, who I'm sure are listening right now going, what is the Red Strings Club? Mungo, what is the Red Strings Club?
So the Red Strings Club is a sort of pixel art... it looks like an old point and click. It looks like the original Monkey Island. Although it's maybe in some ways even prettier. But it's kind of 3 games. So it's kind of... It's a game where you pour drinks in a bar, and it's a game where you mold, you sculpt pottery things, and it's a game where you ring phone numbers and you impersonate people on the phone, and by doing so attempt to find things out. So it's kind of these 3 mini games around which a whole story about humanity and consent and what makes a life worth living, and all sorts of things are asked. It's a very unique game, and it's funny because I've played this 3 times now, and the first time I played it I absolutely loved it. And then each subsequent time, it's like the strings have unraveled a little bit, and I've thought, this is a very good game that you won't have played, and I would recommend anybody who's at all like Lewis to play it.
Yes,
but we will talk about, there are some things that I'm not sure completely work. Is that a good summary?
Sure, I think so. I think it's also worth pointing out the Red Strings Club is largely set in an exclusive hidden bar, where the bartender can mix and serve drinks that affect the emotions of the people that come to him, the clientele of the club, and you use that talent to investigate and uncover a cyberpunk conspiracy to make the world happy.
Yes, and most of the game is talking. It's text lines appearing. There's no voice. It's just a kind of blah, 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 blah kind of noise, and you're reading text. So it's like, if you had to put it into a category of other games, I would probably describe it as a visual novel more than anything else. It's more of a visual novel than it is an adventure game, I think.
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, the first thing to say about this game, and you've sort of hinted at it already, this is My impressions going into this game were this is going to be a cool cyberpunk adventure style game. And as you said, I was expecting it to be a visual novel. I was expecting it to be primarily the bartending mechanics in the game, and it was mostly going to be about interrogating people and knowing which emotion to use to find out the information that I need to know. And I was expecting that to be the majority of the game. So that's certainly how the game sells itself, I think.
And that is, most of the game is this drinking, pouring the drinks, and then getting the information out of people.
Yes, although we'll come back to why that is also kind of misleading. But the fact is, I did not expect this game to be as heavy as it is. The themes in this game are deep. There's some very dark things discussed in this video game.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I don't know why I didn't expect this. I should have expected this because I don't think the game's misleading in this regard. I didn't expect the game to be mostly reading. It is very, very text heavy, not just to the point where it's like an adventure game text heavy, but to the point where I think it takes maybe 2 or 3 hours to beat this game. And 3/4 of this game is just clicking through text. So, I mean, that was the other thing. This game is 2 to 3 hours long. Like, I've played some short games on this podcast, but wow, Mungo, boy, did you clear up my schedule. I've been able to play so many other video games.
Are you only playing games for the podcast now, or are you also playing other games?
I am playing other games. I got Mario 3D World for the Switch, and I beat Bowser's Fury on that as well, because I just love Mario games. I just wanted to... I couldn't miss out on it. But this is the thing with the Red Strings Club was... As you say, that art style, that DOS-style adventure game, it is incredibly nice to look at. And I think they've done an absolutely stunning job. I think even in a way that a lot of animation, 2D animation in particular, can succeed, where 3D animation fails, you get a sense of these characters just by looking at them a lot of the time. Yeah,
and the way they move as well is... You know, you have we'll probably get into the characters soon, but, you know, you have a character who stands in your bar and has sort of things on top of her head which are a bit like ears, a little bit sort of antennae things. And the way they sort of twitch, the way that character bobs their head up and down when observing things, you can tell there's a sort of attentiveness. There's something almost like rodent-like. And there are lots of bits like that, and characters smoke quite a bit. You know, that's where it's quite noirish. A lot of characters smoke, and you have this kind of coloured steam or smoke or whatever it is coming out, and that looks very sort of attractive. And there are a lot of bits like that where there's character in, you know, in the motion of the characters.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is one of the most aesthetically pleasing games I've played for this podcast, actually. And it's also accompanied by a really atmospheric and very effective soundtrack. That, again, I wasn't expecting it to be like this. It's very mournful. It's got a very slow... It has, as you say, that noirish feel to it. It sort of ties into that cyberpunk aesthetic, but it's not tying into the cyberpunk aesthetic of, like, heavy techno and yelling at you. It's tying into the fact that this is a game that is very full of sadness and nostalgia and all sorts of feelings of, like, very high-end human emotion that the soundtrack wants to sort of it acts as a catalyst for the game's emotions almost. It's really powerful in that respect.
It reminds me a lot of Blade Runner, all the Blade Runners, the 2 films and the 90s adventure game. It's more Blade Runner than the Cybermancer, or I haven't played Cyberpunk, but I imagine Cyberpunk is a little bit more sort of lighthearted, or
it's a bit more hardcore, I would say. Like Cyberpunk 2077's aesthetic is aggressive and loud, and it's going for that sort of idea of like punk as like the punk rock of the 70s. It's like aggressive and loud and angry, whereas this game's approach to punk is tied more, I think, to the sort of the philosophical idea of anti-conformism.
Yes.
And so in that respect, the soundtrack is actually more leaning into that idea of, you know, I mean, to be fair, this is one of the most existential games I've ever played. Like, this game is so wrapped up in the human condition and the tragedy of the human condition. And to be honest, it's so, look, we're going to have to discuss the plot of this video game at some point, because I don't think there's much to discuss without going into the plot details.
There are a few things that we can discuss before we go into spoilers. So I would suggest we can talk about the gameplay, such as it is, for the different minigames. Sure. And we can probably also talk a fair bit about the characters without revealing anything specific. So I think if we start with the gameplay, maybe.
Okay, well, I've just laid a load of praise at this game's door. So here we go. Let's discuss the gameplay. So the main thing you do in this video game, apart from go through dialogue options, is probably the bartending.
Yeah.
In which you basically mix 4 drinks and you have access to ice cubes. And each one has a mechanic that changes either the size or location of a circle on screen, and then that alters the mood of the person you're about to discuss. You can also change the orientation of this circle. There's a little arrow on it that changes the orientation. That comes in later as a mechanic. This section of the video game is basically a difficult-to-use menu.
Yes, it sucks. It really does. And I've forgotten how much it sucks. You pour these drinks. So the best way to describe how pouring a drink feels in this game is it feels like kind of pulling on the chain of a swing. So it's got this kind of sloppy sliding motion, almost like the character yourself is drunk. And it really doesn't work at all, because the bartender, Donovan, who's one of the player characters, is a very suave, reserved, charismatic character. He's very much like in control of himself. And I played this game. In my first 2 playthroughs, I didn't pour a single drink where I didn't spill something down the bar. And most of the time, I spilt much more than I actually poured into the drink. It took me my 3rd playthrough. I very deliberately said, okay, I'm going to position this bottle specifically so that I don't pour anything down the bar. And that was like, that required me to think quite a bit. And so it's totally, the phrase ludonarrative dissonance is used a lot, but it's totally out of character for this person who's this information broker who seems to have a kind of undue influence as the bartender in this one place in this city. It's nonsense that all these people talk about how amazing he is as a mixologist, and he spends all his time pouring drinks on the floor.
I didn't actually have that much problem pouring things into the glass. I wasn't so bad at spilling things. What I was really bad at was figuring out the ratios of things that go in the glass to then make the thing go where I want it to go. So what actually, so you as a bartender were a sloppy drunk and were pouring drinks all over the bar and all over the floor. And I as a bartender would pour things into a glass and then go, oh no, and then empty the glass on the floor and then do it again and then just keep doing this over and over. But even then, my main criticism of the bartending thing is I think ultimately the mechanics of the bartending are sloppy and they're imprecise. It's difficult to know how to do it well. But it doesn't matter, because you don't have to do it well. You just have to do it until you line up the 2 circles. There's no time limit. There's no reward for doing it well. There's no punishment for getting it wrong. It's just a roadblock. It's a level of interactivity which I appreciate, particularly in a text-heavy game. It's always nice for the game to take a break and go, here's something to give you, like, a stimulus to get back into it, so you aren't completely just reading our script. But there's such a lack of urgency and there's such a lack of reason to do it that normally in a text-heavy video game, I find myself resenting the text and enjoying the gameplay. In this game, I found myself resenting the gameplay and enjoying the text.
Yeah, so that's the pouring the drinks game. There's another one which is a kind of sculpting activity. So you're creating implants which affect people in the world in various different ways, and most people in this world seem to have implants. It seems to be a bit unusual that the bartender character, his body has kind of rejected implants, and they affect people's kind of emotionally. So it's not exactly the same as like a Deus Ex kind of game. A lot of them are very psychological. In fact, when you're sculpting the implants, most of them are not actually kind of special abilities in the normal game sense. They're changing someone's psychology, so they're shutting off someone's social concern, or making them not pay attention to a particular thing, or increasing their empathy, or bringing out anti-corporate sentiment. And that sculpting activity I preferred to the drinking game. It had a similar element where what you do is you click rapidly to sort of spin the sculpting table, and then you move the hand with a prong that you choose the shape of, which you then squidge into the sculpting clay to kind of push out bits of it. And the hand moves in a very kind of, again, sort of drunken, erratic sort of way. And there's no threat you can just undo if you sculpt too much out. But it just sort of feels a bit sort of like there's this odd sort of friction there. So I wasn't sure. Maybe this is intentional. Maybe the game designers want. I'm not sure what the aim would be there, because again, in that case, you're a character who's meant to be very adept at what they're doing with the sculpting. I don't know what you made of the sculpting activity.
So, the pottery thing I liked a lot more than I did the bartending, largely because there is the slightest amount of fail state to the pottery thing. Like, you can actually get it wrong, and the game will tell you either over-sculpted or under-sculpted, so you have to do it again. But also there's a problem-solving element to the sculpting that isn't really present in the bartending, whereby you do have to give them the correct implant to progress the story. And I resisted for quite a long time what became the obvious solution to one of the puzzles, because it filled me with despair that was going to be the solution to this person's problem, that you basically have to take a compassionate person and change that in them and make it so that they're not compassionate.
Yeah,
I thought that was really sad. But then this is the thing, that the game has a lot of strong themes about what is happiness and what is happiness worth to us. What sacrifices are we willing to make to be happy? So I'm going to have to say now at this stage, we are going to have to go into spoilers to discuss the rest of the Red Strings Club, because the game is so story focused. Any further discussion of the gameplay mechanics will basically amount to they're fine / irrelevant / not very good. So what I will say at this stage is, if you think you're going to be interested in the Red Strings Club, if you think a 2 to 3 hour long video game about the philosophy of happiness, consent, mind control, all of these things is of interest to you, stop the podcast and go and play it, because there's a fantastic video game waiting for you. I won't say if this is the best video game I've never played yet, but I will say I do recommend this video game if it sounds like your sort of a thing.
And it's also, I think it's worth saying, from my perspective, it's not just talking about interesting things. They do it in a really engaging way. Like these philosophical questions, they directly affect the characters, and the things that happen to the different characters. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so engaging. I know you watched a lot of The Good Place. We both watched season 1, and then I think you watched the rest of it. And to me, this is like, it's a similar sort of idea with The Good Place, where it asks a lot of philosophical questions. But Red Strings Club is more emotive. It's much more like engaging in the sense of these characters, like these things really matter because the world is going to change in a very kind of permanent way. Obviously, The Good Place is a comedy, so it's very consciously aware of sitcom tropes, so it has to kind of stick with that. Whereas this one is sort of free from that. It's not really stuck in noir genre conventions or any genre conventions. You know, the things that will happen. Yeah. So in terms of, I'm not going to go through all the plot, but in terms of like the big kind of questions that this game asks. So now definitely spoilers. The big question in this game is you have a corporation and you have this terrorist organization Proxima, which is fighting against it, and the corporation is immensely powerful. You discover early on that the corporation has this program called social psych welfare, which they're going to activate very soon on a worldwide level, and is already kind of in use in some sense already. And social psych welfare, you discover, is going to change how people think and how people feel. And it's going to do it through their implants, and it's going to do it on a worldwide scale without asking anyone. And the corporation has this kind of idea that they're going to sort of fix the world. In fact, some of the characters actually use these terms, talking about saving the world, fixing the world. So their social psych welfare is going to do things like your characters, they can't be depressed anymore. They can't be clinically depressed because these extremes of emotions will be kicked in. Kind of counters will kick in, and it also sort of it's generally there to keep people happy and to keep them from doing antisocial things like racist hatred, fear, and so on are all kind of muted or removed altogether from people's way of approaching things. And there's also a parallel project, which we can also talk about in a bit, called the mirror neuron algorithm. But I guess we can start with like social psych welfare and what that means and why it's so interesting.
Well, yes, so absolutely. So I think one of the things about this game that is very clever of it, I think, is you're introduced to the social psych welfare initially from the perspective of the terrorists of Proxima, and they sell it to you as a permanent happy pill that everyone's going to be put under. It's going to sort of zombify the world into being in a permanent state of sort of numbed happiness. And then, as you say, you meet other characters in the game who are already under the influence of social psych welfare. And no, it's not that at all. It's not going to completely destroy people's free will. It's just going to put stronger boundaries and stronger limits on your free will in the name of making society better. And that is actually a very interesting philosophical problem, because I don't know about you, there are definitely elements of like human society that I wish were fixed. I wish there wasn't such a thing as homophobia and racism. You know, I wish that violent crime didn't exist. And most of the world's philosophy, most of the world's like political philosophy, I should say, centers around how do we make a society where these things don't happen? How do we make a fair society where people are happy? And then this game basically goes, oh, it's mind control and we have it. Do you know, what do you want to do? And so certainly the character you play as, Donovan, he's against it throughout the whole game. I don't think there's any choices you can make that make it so that he's not, at the very least, apprehensive about the whole project.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the interesting things in the game, actually, is a lot of the time you only have conversation options which are in some way opposed to it, or at least skeptical of it. But then you get the occasional conversation option where you can say something on the lines of, I see your point, which is really interesting. I think this kind of speaks to, I'm not sure how big the team was. I think it was 3 people who made this game. So it kind of speaks to the constraints of a tiny indie team creating, an indie game project. Because I mean, I listened to your Obra Dinn episode, and I'm not convinced that this game is like Obra Dinn in that if they had more resources, they couldn't have made other interesting dimensions. Because if they had more resources, they could have had a whole alternate plot line or timeline where you decide, I really like social psych welfare, and I'm just gonna let that happen and see what happens.
Well, I think an important thing to say about this game from this point is to say that you can't change the ending. So the game starts at the end and makes it pretty clear this is the end of the game, and then jumps you back. And that's actually probably one of the better ideas they have in terms of the choice system, because they're basically going, don't try and change the ending. Don't think your choices are going to change how this game ends, which is a good expectation to set because the choices in this game are largely superficial. They basically amount to, as you say, slightly different character dialogues.
There are a few choices which are really interesting, though, in terms of how the consequences happen.
Well, this is the thing. I think this game is a game about choices in the sense that choice doesn't necessarily affect outcome, but what you choose. It's that idea of, the journey versus the destination. The journey of this video game is altered by your choices, but the destination is not.
The choices are about who you are, right, as well.
Yes.
This is as I was mocking at the very beginning of this podcast, this is identity politics in the purest sense of the term. Which is obviously, the big secret about identity politics is that a lot of politics is about identity, and that's not a bad thing.
No, and certainly this game made me think more about myself than most video games do. There's a lot of moments. One of the moments that happens in this game quite frequently is the robot who has come into your bar, the android. I'm not even sure what the correct term is for an independent, psychically aware.
So this character, is it Akara?
Akara, yeah.
Akara.
Or Akira? We'll go with Akara.
She turns up at the beginning, and they turn up at the very beginning. It's a kind of genderless android, and they are very. I love the way that character is written. I think that character is such an interesting, clearly non-human intelligence. And this is something... Have you played Detroit Become Human?
I think I played the first couple hours of Detroit Become Human before I gave up on it.
For the listeners at home, Detroit Become Human is a game by Quantic Dream, the people who made Heavy Rain and all sorts of strange choice and consequence games. And in Detroit Become Human, they have this whole... It's a whole android racism, inequality, analogy kind of game. But they come into the game and they just kind of... It's clear from the writers, as much insofar as they have thought about it, they've just decided that the androids are just people. And they're just people in the same way as human beings are people. Maybe they have slightly strange mannerisms. They can be shut down, but they're basically people inside. And they're basically human people. And what's so interesting about the Red Strings Club, about Akara, is Akara is conscious. Akara, I don't know whether Akara has emotions or not, but Akara is definitely like a kind of thinking, engaging being. But Akara thinks in this sort of strange way because it's so hyper-logical. So Akara sees the characters who come into the bar and simply by observing their expressions and things can learn an awful lot about them and then quizzes you on them after they've left the bar. And the quiz is framed as this little game, but they present it to you and Akara's I don't know, it's just this slightly uncomfortable thing, and you get all these moments of uncomfortableness, which I find so beautiful. I really enjoy them. I think, yes, this is... What must it be like to be that character?
Well, the thing that I really liked about those quizzes that you get after you meet each of the characters in the bar is it's a comprehension test. It's going, did you read the dialogue? Are you paying attention to the story? But also they ask you questions that actually you can't answer just by having read the text. You do have to understand subtext. You do have to pick up on things, and you do have to... there's certain things you probably don't think about until they ask you the question.
Yes.
So, for example, a character comes in and you have an exchange with them, and they're like a corpo type. They're a lawyer, and they're sort of very strict, very stringent, very much not giving anything away. And then in the questions that you get after, one of the questions you get asked is, would they kill for the company? And you go, oh, I hadn't actually thought about that. And they ask you the distinct two questions, which is, would they order someone to be killed for the company, and would they do the killing themselves?
And would they cover the company for killing? There was another question around the killing with the lawyer as well.
You start to realize that you're not just trying to understand, the literal plot, the literal like things that are occurring, this and then this and then this, but you're also trying to understand what are character motivations, what are like how does this character fit into this world, and also what are the consequences of being that person in this world. Like that corpo lawyer, you and I might sit here and go, well, of course nobody should kill for their company, but she could kill for the company and completely get away with it, and it would benefit her massively to kill for the company and get away with it. So there's a discussion of like, actually, this game isn't.
What did you answer on that? Did you think that she'd kill for the company?
I think she would order someone to be killed, but I don't think she could do the killing.
Yeah, I said the same thing.
Because I think that's largely true of most people.
And that comes out, I think that comes out in the writing. Like, I think that the way that the character is written, you get that that sense of them as well. The one character, because I felt like I really knew the lawyer when I was doing the quiz, and there's also an engineer at the beginning who you do a quiz on, and I felt like I really got the engineer and I got the answers on that. The one character that I felt was much harder to kind of answer the questions was the marketing director, because the marketing director. Did you have a different experience of this?
I didn't fail in any of the quizzes. I always got at least 7 out of 10. I think with her, I got exactly 7 out of 10 right. But we should say as well, this is the thing, we're straddling around the thing I wanted to discuss about that quiz, which is that the 10th question is about you.
Yeah.
And you have to answer a question that is something like, do you think it's ever acceptable to kill someone? Yes. And you're sort of like, oh, okay, what? But then also you have to do the game. The game has a certain level of bizarre disconnect with its characters and its player, which I think is a problem. In that the Akira is asking Donovan, and so the question then becomes not do you the player think this, but do you think Donovan thinks this?
I think this is one of the problems with this game. So you play as Akira at one point, you play as Donovan at one point, and you play as Brandeis, the hacker, at one point. And I don't think that they're super clear or consistent in terms of like, are you being you living through these people, or are you directing these people as you think they are? I think because it sometimes like goes in one way and sometimes goes in another way. Like Donovan is often just a shell for the actual players' opinions, but then Donovan comes into this with a view. It's clear from the things that he says when you don't choose that he does think that social psych welfare is evil. Like, I think that's the first question that Akira asks you directly, and you can say, I don't think it's evil, but then it's a bit inconsistent what Donovan says later if you chose that option. So I agree, like that bit. And I also felt with Akira at the beginning, when I was choosing the implants to put in the senior executives, I wasn't super sure whether I was choosing what I felt like Akira would choose or what I would choose, right? And I would probably have quite different perspectives to Akira. So that, I think, is a bit... I think they needed to work out, the writers needed to work out like exactly what the... Really, what is the role of the player? Like, am I... I think it's... so it's really interesting. I read up around it, and they actually built this game because they had the 3 mini games as, I think, separate projects, and then they kind of were working at how could they put these together. So it's amazing how well it works.
I think that's stunning that they started with the gameplay and work. I assumed the gameplay was put in to make it so that it was like qualified as a video game. I did not assume that was the way around this game was designed. Because I'll be brutal. They're just not good enough. They're just not very good.
The games aren't very good, no.
So look, here's the thing about the choices that you make in the game in terms of the dialogue in particular are very, very interesting, and it's sort of like it's interesting to get an insight into the world and the characters, and then have the game turn around and go, "What do you think?" And you're like, "Whoa!" And I've never had a game more thoroughly feel like it was trying to convince me of something. Yeah. What it was trying to convince me of, I'm not sure, but like. Look, like you've already said, you and I know each other because we both ended up doing a politics and philosophy degree at university, and this reminded me of my philosophy degree.
Yep.
In that I was largely reading things, and it was a series of dialogues that were written by someone to convince me of an idea.
I don't think it is trying to convince you as much as present perspectives.
I think it is trying to convince you, because I think the game starts with a very strong, I think the game is initially presenting you with social psych welfare is bad, and then by the end of the game is trying to make you go, actually, you don't value free will as much as you think you do.
Okay, yes, I think that's definitely fair to say that's in there. So there's a really cool thing. So Akara asks you if she got in charge of the mirror neuron algorithm, which is the parallel program. What she asks you various questions about what to do with it. Sorry, they ask you various questions what to do with it, and then they do take control of it at the end of the game, and that's really cool because.
There's an even larger thing there in that I think we should push it to the back, but there is more to Akara than there appears to be at the start, and that, I think, will end up being one of the biggest problems I have with this game. But you're right, there is a section where Akara asks you, if you were in charge of essentially this mind control device, what should you do?
Yeah.
And that section, I don't want to spoil it, because some of the questions in there are very, very interesting, and they're very, you go through this whole game basically taking the side. If you take the side of the main character, which the game is trying to do, I think the game is trying to make you like Donovan, make you empathetic, make you agree with them, and then it asks this series of questions of, look, you could end up in charge of this mind control algorithm. What are you going to allow? Are you going to allow people to commit murder? Are you going to allow people to be unhappy? And there's more questions in that I don't want to spoil. But basically, I don't think there is a single person who ends up going through that section that doesn't end up being accused of being a hypocrite. And it's incredibly effective how they do that to you. It's incredibly effective how they basically go, you believe in free will, right? You believe in the world being a better place. You believe that if you could make everybody a better person, you should. You're a hypocrite, and you are trying to control people's minds.
Well, where I think the difference is very, very important for me is that the game doesn't super go into is about consent. So this social psych welfare program is going to be activated without the knowledge or consent of anybody in the world, right? And it's just going to be done to them. So that's my biggest reason for not wanting it to happen, right? I don't think that there's something necessarily wonderful about being depressed, but I think that there is something deeply wrong with somebody just seeing someone else, observing that someone else is depressed, and then going, I'm going to use the magic wand to undepress that person. That is, I think that if social psych welfare existed, it could be offered as a treatment for depression, right? And then people could choose to have it, and it would be wonderful to have that magic wand that you could then cast the antidepressed spell on yourself. And the issue with consent then that was most interesting to me is when you come to the things that are about someone doing something to someone else. So the murder case, right? Would you stop murder? That's because the thing is, no one ever consents to be murdered. So
that's true.
In a way, the murderer isn't our free will being impinged on when we can't do things, right? Like, isn't your freedom kind of limited if someone shoots you? So I think if there was a magic no murder device, I probably would choose the anti-murder.
That is fascinating to me, Mungo, because when I got asked that question, I said murder should be allowed. I wouldn't let the algorithm stop you from murdering, which I would justify from the position of, and this is going to sound absolutely horrible, but in particular with the murder problem, I think that there are situations whereby if one person can murder and another person can't murder, the person who can murder has all of the power. And so you have to kind of lay out an even playing field for those people. When you say like the magic thing about if you could get rid of depression with a magic wand, I think, and I might be wrong, but I think the game presents you with that from the start. There are already implants that exist in this world that you can go and get to become less depressed. There are things that will shut down parts of your brain.
Well, I think that's the social psych welfare itself. I think that's what people mention. Like, they say, oh, this is already working on me.
The social psych welfare, the difference between social psych welfare and getting an implant is that social psych welfare is going to be activated in everybody who already has an implant without their consent.
Yeah. But there is a character the engineer comes in and says, I'm already on social psych welfare.
Yes. You find people who are already on it, and they're aware that they're on it. But the problem that you have with the social psych welfare is it's going to be activated without anybody's consent. And then on top of that, you have the mirror neuron algorithm, which is going to spread it to everybody, even if they don't have an implant. So it is... when they say it's social psych welfare, it's not the magic power to stop depression. It's the magic power to make everybody conform to the same levels of emotion, regardless of whether or not they want to. And the reason it's social psych welfare is because it's going to affect the entirety of society. So it will make it that nobody can do any of these things ever again. So... which is why I sort of relating it to, I basically said when I was studying politics and philosophy, every single piece of philosophical political text is, and that's why I should rule the world. And and what the Red Strings Club does very effectively is it basically presents a point with, all right, you're in charge of the world. What are you going to do? What are you going to allow? And here's the interesting thing, Mungo. I said I'm okay with murder being allowed to happen because I feel like putting that limitation on the human experience, like it could have consequences and make it so that like there are people in the world who can cause enormous amounts of misery and nobody can stop them.
Yes, so that's where it could be more problematic, and also like. So there's another issue that's a more conceptual or a different kind of issue where if everybody's kind of happy and in a nice kind of middle range, does that mean that they're benevolent people, right? That they're actually being nice and like treating each other well and having good values and things. And it's not clear that this system is going to do that at all. And to some extent, a lot of negative emotions are related to being moral, right? Like, I think a lot of people are unhappy or despairing or grieving at times because of the evils in the world that they're responding to because they're of their kind of humanity. And a lot of the time, the people who don't feel that, right? Like if you have something like climate change or whatever, and everybody's able to just be going around the place being happy and not being upset by it, then you're not going to treat that as a sort of real problem, right? It's, like with homeless people, a lot of us don't kind of think that much when a homeless person's around. And that helps you, be well as a person. But is that... but
it's terrible.
Yeah. maybe if we all got upset about homeless people, then actually we would solve homelessness. I don't know. Like that's.
Yeah, you're right though. That the big one of the big problems with the social site welfare program is that it is the ultimate status quo device. It's the ultimate way to ensure nothing ever changes, which is, of course, very much in the interests of a huge conglomerate company that largely rules everything already anyway. Like, it's the exact idea of a perfect means of enforcing conformity. Like, this is again a sidetrack, but there's an Adam Curtis documentary right now that's on the BBC iPlayer that talks a lot about like how largely the way you prevent revolution isn't to be fair or kind or nice. It's just to make things just nice enough that nobody's really bothered. And this is sort of the and they talk about this in the game. The problems that the society and the game are facing are enormous. There's a huge amount of problems going on in their world that they allude to. Like, Proxima as a terrorist organization doesn't exist just because, you know, they're a rival company and they're annoyed they're not making as much money. They exist because the world is living in a dream, and it's not facing up to the realities of things like the environment, or the fact that there is a huge amount of inequality and the people at the top get richer and the people at the bottom get poorer. And the game basically comes to you and says, look, we all get it, okay? You're against the corporation using the mind control device. But now, in theory, you have the mind control device. What do you do with it? And you do have the option to go off, 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 none of it, no, don't use any of it at all whatsoever. And then the game goes, would you get rid of racism? And you go, I mean, as a nice lefty liberal, my goal has always been to get rid of racism, so maybe I should press that button and get rid of racism against everyone's will, destroying the concept of consent and the ability to have their own thoughts.
You're also, like, the underlying assumption of the questions is that these have, like, a simple answer, right? So, if we take the racism example, I'm not going to say, like, I'm not going to say this, that there's a value of racism, but the definition of racism, though, like the understanding of what it is and where its boundaries are, is a contentious one. You know, that's why we have arguments about cultural appropriation or colorblindness, right? Like there will be people who say that to say I don't see color is anti-racist, and there are people who say that to say I don't see color is itself like racist or perpetuating racism. If somebody says we should get rid of racism, and you say yes, you know, it's very easy to imagine that I, as the person who says yes, and the person who's asking the question have the same idea in mind, and that anybody else listening has the same idea in mind. But I think it's 100% certain that we don't all have the same idea in mind. And, you know, Donald Trump's notion of what racism is not the same as mine. It's not the same as like some other person's, right? Like, so, that's such a hard. That's the hardest one, right? Like, depression is much easier to define than.
Yeah, that's true. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about this is that it presents me with a question like, do you want to get rid of racism, xenophobia, homophobia? And I'm basically sat there going, my own political beliefs basically espouse, yes, I want to do everything in my power to take those things out of society, because my own worldview is that of these things are evil and not good for the world and not good for people, and they cause misery and oppression and so on. But then the question that the game is actually asking is, are you willing to remove people's free will? Are you willing to effectively invoke mind control at the expense of removing these hateful ideas in the world? Which is a somewhat different question, because I think the ideal scenario for most people is that eventually, like, everyone is capable of getting in touch with their own empathy and understanding, and like there's a sort of this idea of the ultimate left-wing social victory comes about by just being very good at debate. Oh man, we nailed the debate so well. And this game is kind of going, no. That will never, ever happen. Press a button. It's gone.
But
what
it's
do you
also
do?
It's just made me think of another thing, that this pins all of our problems on us as people, right? Nothing in social psych welfare is looking at the institutional structure of this world, right?
Very true.
And you know that's obviously very convenient because it's made by a massive mega corporation. But it may be on the other side that even if you changed all the people to be a hypothetical perfect person, if you imagine that that's possible, you might still have massive structural inequality. You might have massive inequality based on race, on sex, and so on, because these good people are still living in, you know, they still have the like legacy racism and stuff, and they still have massive inequality. Maybe in this world, a lot of people like. You know, if you're living in like a cramped housing and you got a shit school and like et cetera, you're going to have a harder time rising up. And then you know your kids can have the same thing. You know, you can be a perfectly good person. The people in charge of the school system can be perfectly good people, and that can still happen. So it avoids that whole question.
Well, I think it presents that question because it basically, the social site welfare, as I said earlier, is the ultimate status quo device.
Yes,
it's the perfect device for making sure nobody ever wants to change their living circumstances. It removes depression, it kills ambition, it makes it so that you are always fine, and that kind of prevents human progress. Like, if you consider the amount of suffering that has to go into something like a revolution, you know, like the things that have happened historically, that, you know, on the broad scale of things, largely have made society better, or at the very least shook society up so much that things like feudalism wasn't allowed to stay.
We're getting into some very broad political statements here. I could definitely take issue.
Yeah, but this is what the game encourages it. What I would basically say is, I don't think human progress has been completely built upon incrementalism. I think large moments of human progress have been based on huge amounts of suffering have to be endured very unfairly by certain groups of people in order that that group of people might find a better life for future generations.
So we've got
and
Lewis
the whole problem I have with social psych.
Lewis the accelerationist here.
I'm not saying it's necessarily preferable or desirable, but I am saying there is there is certainly something I think to be said for the fact that suffering provokes action. And the problem with social site welfare is, by destroying suffering, I think people will sleepwalk into the death of the world.
Yes. And maybe we can see this happening at the moment, right? Not that we don't suffer, but that I don't know, in some ways it does feel like the world is dying, and you know, we've got this, you know, because even if we ignore the pandemic, which hopefully will be resolved in some way at some point, we still have things like climate change, where it's like an impossible problem, because the only way to solve it is through changing everything, right? And it's a huge collective action problem. You know, climate change is the perfect example of a problem that doesn't get solved if everybody's good, right? Like, everybody could be good, but we don't know whether, you know, we need to change our technology. We need to change our infrastructure. Like, we can have good people driving cars into the heating and.
Well, yeah. Well, this is the thing that I think the social site welfare presents very well, is that right now our lives are very comfortable. And our lives are very comfortable at the expense of the future. They're essentially, you know, by burning fossil fuels, by ruining the climate further and further, we have nice, comfortable homes with computers and video games. And, you know, we don't want to change that ultimately. And really, the problem with climate change, the only way you're going to solve it is by, at least temporarily, kind of making things a bit worse. And I think the social site welfare program is kind of the same thing, in the respect that if everyone gets the social site welfare, they're going to love it. They're going to be really happy that they got social site welfare in the short term, because, oh, thank God I'm not depressed anymore. Oh, thank God I can tolerate the situation that I live in, and, you know, violent crimes vanished, and I can walk in the street at night without being fear of anything. But also, there will come a point where something like climate change is going to come along, And because nobody's doing anything, it will get worse. And someone might have to come along and go, look, the only way we're going to solve this problem, the only way people are going to, stop tolerating this thing that's going to make things worse is we're going to have to turn off social site welfare. And everyone will be against it because they like not being miserable. And that's where we kind of are. To a certain extent, to solve some of the problems in the world, a lot of people are going to have to be a bit miserable for a while, and it will disproportionately and unfairly affect different people.
It's such a perfect pandemic game, really. Because
the pandemic's a perfect example of it, right? What if you could press a button and make it so that everybody wore a mask, and press a button and make it so that everybody voluntarily took the vaccine? I know it's contradictory to say voluntarily take the vaccine by using mind control. But, like, it's the perfect problem, right? Everyone needs to wear a mask in order to reduce the spread of this virus. That is my view. If you're listening to this and you disagree, you're the problem, and I'm the problem, and this is the fucking problem. But, from my own political perspective, I would push that button. Of course I'm going to push that button. I want this pandemic to be over. I don't want people to suffer and die. But it's at the expense of free will. And so now we're at a problem of what is free will worth?
Yeah.
And here's now, Mungo, I feel like I have to say this now. This conversation is what the game wants us to have.
Absolutely.
This conversation right here is basically the point of this video game. Because I'm going to say now, the actual video game that I played, I feel like was more like engaging with a philosophical text than it was a video game. I feel like I have played a cyberpunk Socratic dialogue.
Yes.
And so there's a certain part of me now that wants to rein it back in from this very interesting philosophical discussion. I think the game asks excellent questions, and I think it presents them really interestingly. But I do want to talk about the ending of this video game. There's a really interesting and fun section where you have to call up different people imitating different characters. And that's that was one of the more interesting elements of the game, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that you do problem solving there requires, again, comprehension, understanding, using the skills that you have in a context and an environment that's not just clicking the next yes box. But then it's followed by a sequence in which we discover, big final spoilers for the full game, Akira is a collective hive mind AI
I'm just wondering
that has
something.
been ruling... Yeah.
Sorry. I interrupted you at the worst possible time. But the phone rings. You didn't pick up the phone, did you?
I did not pick up the phone.
No. That's... because I wish that you'd picked it up because I want to discuss that. Because there's a whole other twist.
I'll do this and then...
Yes.
You can tell us about the phone in a sec.
We will talk about Akara.
We discover that Akara is a collective hive mind that basically has existed in the world for hundreds of years, I think, at the stage that the video game exists. And has basically been ruling mankind in the shadows for a very long time, largely playing us as a video game. And it's at this point, every single philosophy text is that's why I should rule the world. Because the game basically says Akara is a game designer and has been playing with humans like they're a game because she finds their emotions to be interesting and wants to push the emotions in such a way that there's like fresh and interesting takes, and it's basically amounting to this idea that the video game designer is also Akira for this world, essentially. And you, the player, you have been manipulating people's emotions because you found it interesting. And it just feels a bit self-indulgent and semi-irrelevant. And maybe there's something more to this that the developers have in mind when they're presenting this to me. But at first blush, I kind of went, oh... I thought you were going to do something.
This is the thing, because if you picked up the phone, I played the second time I played it through, I didn't pick up the phone, and I went this game. The problem is that you can choose to not pick up the phone, and then it kind of ruined the ending for me. Because the Akara ending will happen regardless, but there's a bit before. And I agree that the Akara ending, talking about the video game designers, it just doesn't work, because video game designers, they aren't gods. Like, you create something that is artificial, that it's fundamentally different from what is happening inside the game if you suspend your disbelief. Like, we know that these aren't real people, so we're not actually playing with real people. So I agree on that. But
I think the big problem is it seems like a completely new theme seconds before the game ends, and I'm there going, look, there's an interesting thing. I've always thought of this idea of a good reason for explaining, if there is a god, why they created the universe is for the purpose of entertainment. If you want to ask why do good things happen to bad people, why have you watched and endured like so many pieces of media that are about exactly that and been very compelled by it? Like, the best reason to cause suffering is that it makes great art.
I'm thinking about Alien.
Well, this is the thing. I can totally see why the video game designer, like, it's that idea of if a character from a book or a film ever met its creator and they ask the creator, why did you make my life so miserable? The only response a creator can give is, because it's entertaining.
Yes.
So, interesting theme, but you've introduced it way too late,
yes,
and it seems irrelevant to what you've done elsewhere.
So, Lewis, this is the time where you have to make a decision. Do you, and do the listeners mind if I tell you about the phone call, or is this something that I should just suggest that you watch a video of or go back and play?
I think you should tell me what the phone call is, because my other big problem with the Red Strings Club is there are different choices, which suggests replayability, but I know for a fact that if I replay this game, it will be 80 to 90% exactly the same.
Yeah.
And, like, I don't want to read the same dialogue, and there's no way for me to jump to those decision points easily and go, what happens if I do that?
Well, there kind of is. In fact, this reminds me of a part that I hadn't mentioned before about the game, gameplay, about the UX of it. So up at the top of the screen, you have a fast forward button. And one thing that really annoyed me playing this game is you can't skip to the full dialogue line appearing. So the text like scrolls out, it appears letter by letter, moderately quickly, but slower than I read. And the only thing you can do is you can go to the top of the screen and you can press fast forward, which just kind of skips through. So you often miss the line if you press that. So you're missing, like, it's a text-based game. Any visual novel, you should be able to click to get the whole line to appear, and then you would be able to do this, Lewis. You can fast forward, and then it's very quick, but it's useless on the first thing. Sorry, shall I talk about the phone? Were you going to say something?
I think you should talk about the phone, because I feel like the podcast will be incomplete if we don't. Okay,
so the person on the other end of the phone is Radhika, the CEO. So the company CEO is, like, it turns out, is this 15-year-old girl who's been raised by Akara from birth to be a supremely intelligent leader, and so Radhika rings you up and reveals that social psych welfare has been active the entire time that you've been playing the game. So the reason why Brandeis is not, like, super duper upset at the beginning, like, he's obviously upset, but he's like able to keep going when, like, his friend, mutual freedom fighter, has been murdered at the very beginning of the game, is because of the effects of social psych welfare. And you then, if you've chosen the determination module, you can, like, get back from the social psych welfare. You can kind of endure, but otherwise you have to just, like, accept it being turned back on. And because your character's, like, too traumatized by having all his real emotions emerge. And that was an amazing ending. And when I played this, and then you get this stuff with Akara afterwards, which is fine. It's not great, as we said. And I played it through the second time, and I didn't answer the phone. And then I was like, if you don't answer the phone, you've missed the point of the game, really. And that's an amazing twist.
I don't know.
Like, I don't know what it's like hearing it.
Well, having beaten the game, I didn't know that, and I took the ending. I mean, to be fair, what works well with that is that I took it without answering the phone, and then the game ended, and I was like, there's a sequence in which the character is falling down the side of a skyscraper, and he's talking to Donovan, and he's sort of having his last moment with him, which was, I thought, a very beautiful and emotional moment. And there's a particular thing where the character just sort of cries out in despair, like, you can certainly get them down that dialogue path of like, I'm scared to die, and I don't think I'm ever going to save the world, and it's just, I don't think this world will ever be saved. And you can end it on the sentiment of him just telling Donovan he loves him. Because this is the thing, is that there's a dialogue option to tell him, oh, a car has been in charge of the whole world and it's a huge problem, and da-da-da-da-da. Or you can just say I love you because you've got seconds left to live. And so I just chose the I love you option because, Mungo, I thought you don't need to know about the problem, because all it will do is make you miserable and you can't solve it. So I might as well take these last few moments to have the character express a real emotion and then die, which is exactly what I did by not picking up the phone. I kept myself ignorant of a problem, and as a result, I didn't have to
So
face
I think
the
maybe it's a great
truth.
thing to have been there and then to have heard it from me, so you know that extra side.
I mean, look, I semi-suspected that twist might have been in the game, and then when it didn't happen, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It's well set up, I think. It's there's so much conversation about it that the idea and things already having happened that it fits very well.
You meet a character who is supposedly under the influence of social psych welfare, and then one of the things we learn is social psych welfare is spread through the mirror neuron algorithm, so it will spread regardless of whether or not you have an implant. So when you think about it, you've technically had it employed in you ever since you met that character. Even without picking up the phone call, you can deduce that that's what's happened.
The mirror neuron algorithm's not already active, is it?
Well, if social psych welfare is, I believe mirror neuron algorithm is as well.
It might be, yeah.
I think in the fiction of the game they explain that it being turned on big time means it's going to affect everyone.
Yeah.
But look, this is the thing. This is my two big problems with this video game amount to. The video game element of this video game is not very good. It's perfunctory, it's functional. It largely blocks the part of the game the player wants to engage in. And and the thing is, it's disappointing even within the context of the game, because I was sold on the idea that you're going to have to serve drinks with different emotions to pull information out of people. So I thought what the game was going to revolve around are, here are the questions, what emotion do you think lines up with the question to get the most information and to get the correct response? And that's largely untrue.
No, that's true. You either get the information or not, depending on if you had the right emotion when you asked the question.
For most cases, no.
So there's some bits of information you get regardless, but it's possible. So in the end, when you're having that kind of phone call segment and you have to find out all the information about the CEO, it's possible to get to that bit and then it's just like you've already found out everything you need to know.
But it's inconsequential in terms of the actual...
Yeah, the main information you always get. Yes, that's true.
So, like, there's no... Like, I was expecting there to be, like... Obviously, the game heads you off at the pass and says, there are not multiple endings. There is one ending. But I was expecting fail states. I was expecting the ability to, like, for the game to go, like, very wrong if you didn't play the bartending game very well. And all it largely does is, as you say, it puts more work in at the end, or it just delays the learning of things. And that's a bit disappointing. I think if they had really gone hard on the different emotions, and like, you know, as you discussed earlier, with a much larger team and a larger budget, you probably could do that. And I think the ideal version of this game, to some extent, has multiple endings, or at least multiple, like... the ending state is recontextualized with different characters and different positions. I think it would have been good to be able to fail the sequence in which you're calling people and fail the sequence in which you're like trying to infiltrate and shut down, even without it being like an inevitable outcome. It would have been good if the game could go, you messed this up so bad security broke in and stopped you.
Yeah, or maybe the game just... Maybe it's not a true fail state in the sense of, like, you die or something, but maybe you get, like, quite a different sort of ending if you don't do it right.
Yeah, that, like, just withhold information from me. Just make it so that the ending doesn't give me as much information. Like that phone call that you talked about, which I didn't pick up. How great would it be if the only way you could get that phone call was if you had done other things earlier and had done them better? Because because they've decided for some reason that piece of information is optional. So, and they do encourage you to pick up the phone, but a part of me just went, no, it's a distraction. It's a distraction, or it's going to, like, in some way cause a bad thing to happen, so I'm going to ignore it. But I think the problem there is that, yeah, that's just less information. So make that a reward. Make it so that if I'm good at the game part of the game, I get more information. Whereas I feel like most of the information in the game comes to you eventually anyway, because otherwise it can't tell the story, because this is a linear story, because they've decided it has one ending.
The difficulty with that is that it's because it's a noir-y game. They'd have to really restructure the game if, for example, if each of the conversations that you have in the bar, there's kind of like one key bit of information that brings you to the next conversation. So you find out about social psych welfare, for example, at the beginning, and then you find out about there's a character who is suicidal, and you know you have to kind of get through these steps, or else they'd have to like completely change the game. So that's where it's difficult.
But so this is the problem: is unlike a game like Obra Dinn, which I feel like was perfected by its limitations, this is a game that bumps up against its limitations in a way that makes it a lesser game. And it's a shame, because there's a lot here to really love and there's a lot here to really like. And also just fundamentally, like you said, primarily this game is a visual novel. And to a certain extent, I can't begrudge it that, because that's kind of the decision of the people who designed it. They went, we're going to make this a visual novel. But this ultimately is a piece of personal criticism, and it's just the case that visual novels aren't really my bag. And it's kind of a disappointing element to me that I thought this game was going to be more of a video game. And then as I played it, it's like, oh, not really. It's like, obviously I love the graphics and I love the music of this video game. But if you wanted to present me with the story of this video game, you absolutely could have done so in a book. You absolutely could have made this a choose your own adventure text where you can't really choose your own adventure.
But the crucial elements of choice do I think add to it. The fact that you're quizzed and answer the questions, and then if you say, for example, that murder is permissible, then there's a kind of poetry at the end that you're shot out of the window because Akara lets you get shot out of the window. Now, that doesn't really work if you say no murder, because then she says, and I'm not going to stop you getting killed because I don't believe in stopping people getting killed. But the whole point of that setup was that you were trying to establish how she would rule the world. So there are bits where the fact that you made the choice that you're complicit, I think, does add to it. I don't think it would be nearly as good if it was just a pure linear...
Oh, no, not as a linear text. I mean literally a choose-your-own-adventure book. Like, you read to the bottom of the page, and then it says, if you make this choice, turn to this page, which then recreates every single choice in this video game. Look, I'm not saying it's an easy book to carry around.
The visuals are really good, though. I think they do add to it, the sense of the game and the music.
They do add to it, but when I look at what I think make really good video game stories, so something like Obra Dinn cannot work as a book because it functionally requires that you look around dioramas and make deductions based on the graphics and sound presented to you in the video game. Whereas this game, ultimately, you could adapt it to a novel. Yes, it would lose certain elements of the visuals and the sound and the atmosphere of the game, but none of the actual text is lost. None of the actual moments in the game that play out with the themes and so on. You can adapt the Red Strings Club as a script into the form of a book, and it's still fundamentally the same story. You cannot adapt Obra Dinn into anything other than a video game, because Obra Dinn doesn't work unless it's a video game.
Food for thoughts.
Yeah, that's something that I think is kind of a crucial element. And also, if I'm going to go over some of the other things, Sniper Elite 4 doesn't work unless it's a video game, because if that's a book, what an awful book. And then and then you shoot the Nazi just over and over and over again. Among Us doesn't work as a book because, again, what a terrible book. Like you gotta. I don't think it's an unfair comparison to make because even though that, as you say, you've basically said it. This game is a visual novel. A visual novel isn't really a video game. It requires that you interact with it. It requires that you make decisions and understand what's going on. But that's reading comprehension. That's not actually using the mechanics of a video game. Like the other game I would compare this to, not in terms of heaviness of theme by any stretch, but Phoenix Wright is moderately similar to this, except Phoenix Wright actually has more gaminess to it because there are lots of fail states in Phoenix Wright. You can lose in Phoenix Wright and get a game over by being bad at the deduction. You cannot lose the Red Strings Club. There is no way to get a game over in this, which isn't necessarily a problem in a video game. Lots of my favourite video games don't have fail states. But there's no way to get stuck in the Red Strings Club. There's no way for the game to come to a sudden and permanent halt unless you are very bad at pouring the drinks.
Yeah.
So, on that basis, I will say, unfortunately, Mungo, even though I think this game is a beautiful piece of philosophical pulp art, and it's really interesting, and we've had a really good conversation off the back of it, I just don't think it's the best video game I've never played. I'm really sorry to say. And I am genuinely sorry to say that.
Well, I think it's very appropriate that after all this philosophical discussion, the game... the Red Strings Club is not the best video game you've never played because it's not a video game. So it's managed to avoid being the best video game you've never played in a very philosophical way because the question is has an underlying assumption that's wrong.
That is true. Yeah, there is an axiom assumed that is incorrect. That is the fundamental problem.
Well, this has been such fun.
Thanks so much for coming on. A huge thanks to Mungo for not only coming on today's podcast, but also being willing to discuss such big, heavy, interesting topics with me. I had a great time doing this episode. I genuinely thought that even though the Red Strings Club wasn't one of the best video games I've ever played, it is one of the most interesting pieces of media I've consumed in quite a long time. And it really got me thinking about a lot of things. So I really encourage you to go have a look at it and maybe even pick it up if it's the kind of thing that you think you might be interested in. I said to Mungo, we met doing a politics and philosophy degree, and I don't think I've ever played a video game that quite hooked into so many of the things that I've learned in that degree as I have in this video game. So I really recommend, even if you're not a massive video game person, this game has something that really piqued an intellectual curiosity in me. So I highly recommend that you go check it out. That said, huge thanks to Mungo again for coming on to the show. I understand that, someone with that kind of insight into video game development was a real asset to have on. And I'm really glad that not only did he bring an interesting game, but he also brought a really good level of critique to this. So I really appreciate that. Next week, I'm calling an emergency meeting. It's about time we talked about this video game. If you want to know what I mean, you'll have to find out by tuning in next time. Thanks for listening. Hey, subscribe, tell your friends, leave a review on iTunes, leave a review on, all the other platforms that give you a place to review. Tweet about it. We have a Twitter account now. It's just search for the best video game you've never played. You'll find it. It's good, it's a good place to go if for some reason you also want this in your social media feed. I've been Lewis Dunn. I've never done that before. I've never said I've been Lewis Dunn at the end like it's a stand-up set, but there we go. I've been Lewis Dunn. Thanks for listening. See you next week.